Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rebecca Winthrop. I direct the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. I'm a senior fellow there, and we do lots of research on lots of topics on education globally, but particularly we have deep expertise on education across the developing world. And I am here to talk to you today about leapfrogging in education. What could it be? What could it look like? Can technology help us get there? These are all questions I have been pondering in my research for the last couple of years, and I want to walk you through the questions I've been asking and what I've been finding. So first and foremost, I'm going to put up some words, and I'm going to ask you to just think in your mind, when you think of education systems, and the education sector writ large, which of these words do you most frequently think about? Now, this will be interesting in this group. So raise your hands. When you think of education systems or the education sector, does resistance to change pop in your mind? Most people. Okay. What about cutting edge? Not one. This is a conference on innovation in education. Oh, gosh. What about innovative? A few. We have a few hardy adventurers. What about political? Every single person. What about fast-paced? We have two brave people. Yeah, actually, this is fascinating. So this is a conference, and the focus at GESF this year is around the education in the future. We have tons of education innovators, and I was thinking that maybe you all would have a different perspective than the groups I usually talk to around the world, but you are exactly right on par. There is a narrative in education, and certainly those of us who work in education feel this, and those outside of education feel it also, that education systems, the education sector is resistant to change, it's hard to change, it's slow-paced, it's not very innovative. And I was at a conference a couple years ago, and it was an education conference similar to this one, and I was listening to a presentation, and someone said to me, what if we are at an Encyclopedia Britannica conference the year before Wikipedia was invented? And I thought, oh my gosh, what if it's true? What if we are here? What if we are all in Encyclopedia Britannica the year before Wikipedia was invented? And then my second thought was, what if the education equivalent of Wikipedia is never invented? What if we're just going to go on and on and on the same way we have been? And so that's where I really started to think about what would it look like in education to have a Wikipedia moment. And that's where I developed this focus and a slight obsession with the idea of leapfrogging. Now, those of you who were in the morning session with Al Gore, he talked about leapfrogging. He talked about how solar power, wind power can leapfrog over other forms of energy and difficult sort of electric lines. We have the most sort of classic example is mobile phones. Particularly, people always like to reference sub-Saharan Africa because very few landlines were laid for telecommunications in sub-Saharan Africa. Then mobile phones spread incredibly rapidly around the continent and literally leapfrog. People got access to information and connectivity and telecommunications so quickly. In fact, mobile phones spread more rapidly across sub-Saharan Africa than roads, than clean water, and sewerage all put together. And those things people have been working on those for decades. So that is my idea of leapfrogging. What would it look like to make nonlinear progress, to rapidly accelerate, to jump over stages? In the business community, people often talk about disruptive innovation. There's a whole literature coming out of the business community. And at the core of whether it's Wikipedia or mobile phones, et cetera, it's really innovations that helped fuel leapfrogging. So in the case of Wikipedia, it's not only a technological innovations. I mean, the internet was sort of the platform on which it enabled it, but it was also how people related to each other, how they started doing things differently. And so I thought, okay, maybe what I should do is look at education innovations. Maybe that would give me some sort of insight to what could leapfrogging look like in education. And so I did. And I spent the last couple of years with wonderful colleagues, Eileen McGibney and Adam Barton and many others, scanning the globe for education innovations. And we ended up looking at 3,000 education innovations in 166 countries. And I found, wow, innovations are everywhere. Actually, the education sector is not innovative. There's innovations everywhere. People are doing innovations left, right, and center. They might be at the margins and maybe not sort of at the center of the system, but it is incredibly innovative. And lots of new things are happening. And this is a map of these 3,000 innovations. The dark blue are the countries that in our 3,000 are the countries with the most innovations, with 100 plus innovations. And as you go down to lighter blue, they have less innovations. Now, this is not a map of clearly every innovation in the entire world. It's the set of innovations that we looked at in our global inventory of education innovations, which is online, and I'm happy to tweet it out to you guys. My Twitter is @Rebecca Winthrop. I'll be sure to do that afterwards because I didn't put the link. And, you know, what did we find about these education innovations? We found a couple of things. One, the nonprofit sector is leading the way. About 60% of the education innovations were from NGOs and nonprofits, leading, implementing, definitely at the forefront of the education innovation community. Two, the funding of who was funding and financing education innovations was actually pretty evenly split between government, between philanthropy, between the private sector, and the international aid donors, foreign assistance. So the international aid donors are really the anomaly here. They have funded less than 10% of these education innovations. So they don't like to fund education innovations. Perhaps it's too risky politically. We also found that, and I was surprised at this, that actually education innovations are in really high-performing countries. This country up here is Finland. Tons of education innovations. And they're a very high-performing education system, as well as really low-performing education systems. So high performers, low performers are searching for new ways to do things. We also found that, you know, rich countries and poor countries are innovating across the plot. So everybody's looking at it. And we found that only 50% of these education innovations used ed tech in any way. And we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to sort of technology and the potential to leapfrog towards the end. But it's interesting that a lot of them actually are not using ed tech in their innovations. And people are doing all sorts of things, really big scale to really small scale. You have Duolingo, which is, do people know what Duolingo is? Raise your hand. Yeah, most people do, right? Teaching foreign language, and they're reaching 150 million learners, probably more now. I don't know when I took that stat from in the last sort of year, probably it's increased. To really small scale initiatives, there's things like EduCurious, another tech-based, fantastic education innovation that really scaffolds teacher project-based learning in public schools in the US and connects students to an outside expert network so that they can have mentors and tutors in their passion areas. There's Lima, a fantastic innovation that does board games, local board games, no tech, locally made across 14 countries in Latin America that's done in the communities as well as classrooms, massively boosted things like literacy, numeracy among adults, among young people, as well as really improved things like teamwork and collaboration. So there's all sorts of interesting things happening. So then I asked myself, wow, this is amazing. Actually, the education sector is innovative. It's innovating all over. But just because it's innovative does not mean it's good. So I have no idea now, at my stage of the research, if any of these innovations could actually help us leapfrog. Because the real question I ask myself is, well, wait, where are we trying to leapfrog to? Where are we trying to get to? And this is where the education sector is a little bit different from some of the other sectors that are talking about leapfrogging. Now at Brookings, I have really the pleasure of working with incredibly insightful, forward-thinking, fantastic researchers, really innovative people from all sorts of different sectors. And my financial inclusion colleagues are talking about how mobile banking is transforming and leapfrogging access to credit and financial inclusion for poor people and marginalized people across the globe. But there it's very clear what the outcome is. And it's also clear in energy, it's also clear in telecommunications, and those are all markets also. And the business literature that talks about disruptive innovation, there's a clear outcome. It's to make sure your business maximizes profit at the end of the day. And we know that profit is not the goal of education. It's a human right for all kids. So where are we leapfrogging to? Which really led us to this question here. What is the goal of education? So shout it out. Tell me, what if you had to finish the sentence, the goal of education is to blank, what word would you fill in? Let's hear, anybody. Yes, please. It could be a short sentence. I will absolutely allow. Phrases.
So it would be, the goal of education is to help people increase their self-knowledge and become more autonomous and becoming pleno is a great Portuguese word, sorry. 100% citizens and like this,
yep.
Based on themselves to the world. So it's empowering them to become a healthy part of the world.
So agency, citizenship, autonomy, please.
Self-knowledge.
Self-knowledge. Happiness.
More innovation.
Creating more innovation. Others, yes, please. Solve problems.
Maximize human potential.
Maximize human potential. Gauri.
To create empathetic, altruistic, and ethical leaders, to have values back center stage again.
Values, ethical leadership. Yes, please.
To inspire, empower, and engage.
Inspire, empower, engage. Armand?
Can't beat those last two.
Okay, you've got a ditto. What? The last one right here.
To teach people how to keep on learning and love learning.
Lifelong learners. So we have lots of different topics. Although you guys are a pretty cohesive group, I think you all have focused on things like citizenship, agency, lifelong learning, ethics, problem solving. I would put that in sort of a family of things. When I talked, I was in Seattle not too long ago and gave a speech to non-educationalists, and a lot of people said, find jobs. Not one of you guys said find jobs, which is a sign of an education audience. But a lot of people, when I give talks, say jobs and to learn to read well and to learn your maths, etc. So I would add those to the mix. So basically, in order to figure out if these innovations could help us leapfrog, we really had to think long and hard about what is the goal of education. And we did a lot of thinking and a lot of research. And I just want to share with you sort of our top 3 insights that led us to thinking about how we would define where we should leapfrog to. And the first insight, hooray for mass schooling. So in most leapfrogging, we are no longer laying landlines in order to have a mobile phone and a dial-up phone. We are discarding that old legacy infrastructure of landlines. In Al Gore's speech this morning, you had the solar power panel on the grass hut in a village, in a rural community. They didn't need the wire from the coal to bring electricity there. You just leapfrog entirely over that. What I definitely thought long and hard about is we definitely don't want to discard the old legacy system of education, which are schools. For what reason? Well, a couple of reasons. But the main reason is that mass education itself, the idea, education has been around for millennia, but mass education, the idea that every child in a country has the right to go to school and should go to school, and it's important not only for them as an individual, but it helps society overall, is actually a fairly new concept. The idea of mass education, for those historians in the audience, you will know this, came out of Prussia in 1763. The idea was that they wanted a more well-tooled military. So they said, we are going to teach everybody how to read. And there was lots of factors that led to it, including Protestant Revolution and wanting to teach the Protestant Church, wanting to teach their flock how to read so they could read the Bible directly and speak to God directly, including sort of spread of universities, industrialism, nationalism was one of the biggest ones. In fact, mass education spread incredibly rapidly around the world. It is, in my mind, a total massive project in social equality. And you have mass education going from kids enrolled in primary school 200 years ago, 2.3 million kids, to today it's over 700 million. That's 40 times population growth. So this idea of mass education and human rights, every child has a right to education, is really powerful. But more importantly than that, for our argument, is that mass education actually has done so much good for the world. There's very robust evidence that mass schooling has helped populations be healthier, reduce child mortality. It's certainly helped with wealth, GDP growth, employment, salaries rising, absolutely had a big impact on women's ability to work outside the home. There's increasing evidence that increased levels of schooling reduces domestic violence incidents. So my main message, our main insight here was it's a good thing, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater if we're thinking about leapfrogging. Not to mention, what would we do for daycare? I just thought, what if we had no schools? Where would I send my children during the day when I go to work? So, second, insight. Boo for skills inequality. This is, so although it's a very good thing, schools, there are some big problems with schools. And the first big problem is something that I call skills inequality. And when I say skills, I mean capabilities, competencies, academic knowledge, and the full set of abilities and skills that you want young people to have when they come out of education. And when we say skills inequality, what we're really talking about is that current education systems around the world serve kids very differently. And we have a very hard time getting the best out of what we can deliver in today's school systems to every kid. Let me give you a little example. I bet you guys will be familiar. This is from UNESCO. It's one of my old favorites. Education poverty and education extreme poverty is defined as having less than 4 years of school between young people who are 17 to 24 years old. So this is the case of Nigeria. So what's the average number of years of schooling in Nigeria? Maybe we have some Nigerians in the audience. What do you think? Take a guess. Shout out a number. 4, 8. You guys are right in the middle, actually. 6.7. Okay. Now, what if we divide that between the richest 20% of children and the poorest 20% of children? What's the average number of years of schooling for the richest 20% of children in Nigeria? 14. 16, 12. You guys are very optimistic. 9.7 for the richest, but the poorest, 3.5. And then you look at the split between urban and rural. So actually, if you're here you are in the wealthiest quartile, 20%, and the difference between urban and rural is not so huge. If you're really poor and you only have 3.5 years of education, and you're living in an urban area, you actually do much better than if you live in a rural area. So the urban-rural divide is very impactful for poor children. What about between boys and girls? What about the poorest rural girls? How many years of schooling? Average. 2. Yeah, you guys are on it. And if you are unlucky enough, not culturally or anything, but in terms of education services, to be part of the Hausa ethnic minority in northern Nigeria, and you're a girl, and you're poor, and you live in a rural area, you have 0.3 years of schooling. I mean, it's just awful. So this is fundamentally education inequality. This is a huge problem with our education systems. This divide is not just in Nigeria. It's in almost every country in the world. There's some wonderful exceptions up in Scandinavia, especially. In my country, you can also look at learning outcomes. And there's this huge divide. In my country, we have the biggest gap between poor and rich kids on math of any country in the world. So it's in every country, the skills inequality, not being able to get the best of today's education for every child. And if you add that all up across the world, this is from a recent report from the Education Commission, by 2030, over 800 million youth, that's half the youth generation, will reach adulthood without the basic secondary level skills they need to thrive. And it's basic skills. It's basic literacy, basic numeracy, basic critical thinking, and basic problem solving. So that's problem number 2. But on top of that, it's not just about getting the best out of today's education. It's also that we have to reorient every single education system to a future world. Yesterday, I did the experiment that is in this conference where you put on a little headset and you can look at a drone and say in your mind a word and it moves the drone. Has anybody else done this? You should definitely do it. Yes, one person has. It is wild. So the point is, this whole conference is about the future and what's coming, what kind of change is happening. And not only do we have to get the best out of today's education for every kid, every child has to rethink what kind of skills and competencies and abilities do they need to thrive in an uncertain future, because we're not exactly sure. So every education system needs to address skills uncertainty. And let's do another exercise. There's a lot of surveys and studies around the future of work and what kinds of skills will be needed, et cetera. To be honest, there's general themes, and we're going to talk about that in a second. One of the studies I like is from McKinsey that said, look, it's not that whole jobs are going to disappear. It's that mainly the tasks that you do on a daily basis within jobs are going to completely change. So maybe at Brookings, when I'm researching, instead of sitting there typing, in 10 years or 5 years, maybe 2, I don't know, these guys move really fast in the technology sector. I'm just going to stare at the computer and think the words, and they will come up. But the point is that every job is going to have their tasks change. So again, let's do a little quiz. We have different jobs: home health aide, investment banker, welder, cook, accountant. What do you think is the job that's going to have most of their tasks within that job automated? Accountant, number 1. Okay, what's going to have the least automated? Home health aide. And where do you guys think, do you think cook is going to have a lot automated or a little? A little. A lot. No, a lot, a little. Okay, we're split. What about welder? A lot or a little? A lot. Investment bank, all of it. Someone's like, the whole thing, no more welders. Investment banker. A lot. Okay. They're actually in order from least to most. So you guys were pretty on top of it. And this study really shows it's the routine, everything that's repetitive or routine, that's manual, so it's physical labor, or cognitive, and it's routine, is predicted to be automated. And it's the non-routine skills, or including social emotional, being able to work with people, creativity, nuance, that's going to stay. In addition, and the reason cook is so high, actually, you guys were split on that, part of the study is around how much that technology today has penetrated the existing sector. And technology hasn't actually penetrated cooking that much yet. So that's part of why that is so high. But the point is, we have to prepare kids for an uncertain future. So what we really need is for all education systems, this is to me the ultimate goal for leapfrogging, to give kids a breadth of skills. And when I say breadth of skills, I mean they need strong academic content plus, and plus 21st century skills. And you can call it that plus whatever you like. Different countries call it different things, but I mean collaboration and empathy and problem solving and critical thinking and digital literacy and I already said empathy. So all those types of things, particularly that you mentioned at the beginning, agency, and really we need to train kids. Ultimately, they need to have knowledge. We do not need to throw out academics. It's really crucial, but they need to have the skills to manipulate and use that knowledge in different contexts over the course of their lives, in contexts yet to be predicted. Really, we need to ultimately educate for lifelong learners. And so how do you do that? It's really about transforming what and how children learn. So if that is the goal of leapfrogging, we spent a lot of time examining the literature around what is effective in transforming what and how children learn to get to a breadth of skills. And we came up with this. Now, we came up with the Leapfrog Pathway. Now, thankfully, I'm not going to make you read it. I'm not going to talk through it. I will give you the reference of the book that's coming out shortly called Leapfrogging and Inequality, where you will find all this, but I will give you the Cliff Notes version. Here's the Cliff Notes, shorthand, of the Leapfrog Pathway. The ultimate big message is that we need to shift our mindsets, and actually leapfrogging in innovation, including disruptive innovation, is very much about discarding dominant logic, or in the international development space, it's called path dependence, where you think about progressing along the same lines that more advanced countries progressed. Forget that. Don't follow sort of that path dependence or dominant logic. And this is in education. What everyone did, it was what the Europeans did when they started spreading mass education. It's what the developing world did with the Millennium Development Goals. You first get kids into school, access. Just get them in, get them in, get them in. If they're not in, just worry about get them in. Second, you think, okay, they're in. Now we've got to work on academic quality, literacy, numeracy. Okay, once they're got that base, then we work on relevance. Are they learning the types of things they need to thrive in life, in work life, and citizenship, I would argue. And I would say actually what we need is to do all three of those all at the same time, particularly for the most marginalized kids. And so we came up with another version that talks about how you could do all three of those at the same time. And really at the core, it's about transforming teaching and learning. That is at the very core, so that to make space for increasingly student-centered pedagogy. You're not going to discard direct instruction. It's very hard to transform teaching and learning without transforming how you recognize learning. And then, very helpfully, though not required, it's about diversifying people and places and better harnessing technology and data. So let's get to some examples. So my answer is, can we leapfrog? Can technology leapfrog? The answer is yes, but only with the right interventions. So let me go back right here. You see the bottom, technology and data, increasingly results-oriented. Let me just do a deep dive for my last part on this. So within that bottom frame, we use the SAMR model to talk about how technology could be increasingly results-oriented. It's a very common model: substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. If EdTech is deployed to qualify as really leapfrogging, it should modify or redefine what is possible. We found out that of all the technology-related innovations that were on our 3,000 education innovation catalog, 80% of them were either substituting for an analog function or augmenting. So, for example, if you have a multiplication worksheet, you are doing a multiplication worksheet on a tablet. It might be more effective, you might save paper, but you're not ultimately really changing much, to be honest. It's not going to leapfrog. You could augment, where you have a multiplication worksheet on a tablet, and it automatically grades, and that will definitely help the teacher, because they won't have to grade, and they'll be able to see. So that's helpful, but it's not, again, ultimately changing much. You're not massively transforming or able to leapfrog. Only 20% of the education innovations we looked at were in that modification and redefinition. I'll give you two quick examples, and then we'll close. One is from India, Pratam's hybrid learning program, where they had kids who were in primary school, and they did an experiment. They gave them tablets offline, no internet connectivity, loaded with fantastic localized content, and told the kids that they have to share 5 kids to a tablet, actually 10 kids, and they each had 5 groups. The only requirement was the parent had to charge the tablet at night. And they just saw what happened. What ended up happening, in addition to these kids hacking in the first 3 months and bypassing the Proton password and starting to put all their own content on it and videoing themselves and they're interviewing their parents, their literacy and numeracy and academic scores massively increased, in part because they were able to repeat and see, in part because they were curious. Their English scores went off the roof, but more importantly, they started asking a ton of questions. They started asking questions in class, which was not the normal thing that they expected, questions of their parents, and they were starting to learn to navigate digitally. Great example of modification and redefinition. The Brazil, Amazonas, a state in Brazil that's the Amazon jungle, did not have secondary school for a long time, until the Secretary of Education said, you know what we're going to do? And part of why they didn't have secondary school is they have the capital with teachers and schools, etc. But it's the Amazon jungle. The average village is 78 people. And they did not have secondary teachers who were trained who wanted to go live in these remote villages. They wanted to live in the capital. So what did they do? They decided to link all these little schools by 2-way video uplink. And then they took teachers. They're all licensed teachers. They're all part of the same union. They said, we're going to have 2 types of teacher, a lecturing teacher and a mentoring teacher. Some teachers who live in the more remote areas are not and don't have the skills or content knowledge to teach physics or chemistry or science or secondary education curriculum. They're going to be coaches, social emotional learning coaches, and mentor kids. And then you're going to have the content teachers broadcast to 1,000 schools at a time. And it worked out incredibly well. And these kids who've never had secondary school have secondary school, and they're doing amazingly well, and it's scaling across Brazil. So these are 2 examples in my mind of how technology can be deployed in a really innovative way when you think about trying to get towards a breadth of skills as the ultimate goal for leapfrogging. And that's what I ultimately think leapfrogging is. In terms of our next steps at Brookings, we have a book coming out called Leapfrogging Inequality that will be launched at our symposium in May in DC, May 21st, which will be webcast. If nobody wants to travel to DC, I commiserate, I understand why. Some of our next big questions are really doing a deep dive, and I would love any feedback from all of you as we continue with this research. We found that very few education innovations focused on teacher training. Lots on unburdening teachers, but not on actually helping the teacher grow their skills. We also found, we're going to look more into how to better leverage technology, and we also found, and I would love any stories you have, that actually parents can get really scared of very leapfroggy education innovations. We interviewed 100 thought leaders around the globe, and many of them had war stories of doing really innovative leapfroggy things and parents resisting. And if you have stories, we'd love to hear them, and particularly how you overcame that. So that's the end, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. What a wonderful talk, and really, really informative, both in the context of the Tomorrow Strand here with our EdTech startups, but also more broadly in the conference. Thank you so much for your words.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll take a short break now, and we'll have a panel of ministers in just 5 or so minutes, starting at 2 o'clock, to share some of their perspectives on entering their markets. Thank you.